And welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, and experience from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted to have back Keith Harrison-Broninski. Keith, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Fritz. Great to be back. Good to see you again.
Yes, Keith. So a couple of years ago, we talked a lot about your work in collaboration, but there's a good reason to invite you back to the show after a couple of years because we started a new initiative called Iterative, and I definitely want to talk about that. And but also for the context for the audience, you are an author, keynote speaker, a technology consultant, also a magician. We might want to have a look at that at the end as well. But for now, let's take us to what you're doing right now. Because I understand the main issue you are addressing is you want to make AI safe.
Yeah, that's a really big.
And what's your vision there?
So thank you, Fritz. And I came to this, as you say, because I'd been writing a lot about collaboration and how communities could adopt collaboration principles and other ideas to make themselves anti-fragile, to make themselves not just resilient to challenges, but to adapt to them and become stronger in the face of challenges. And one of the big challenges that's emerging now is new technology, and AI is a big part of that. It's not the whole of that. But there is a real opportunity as well as a threat in the emergence of the new AI tools over the last few years. So I've been looking at how it would be possible to adopt this new technology at not just a geographical level in towns, cities, regions, but also for communities of interest to use these tools in a way that is productive, and that means making them safe. Because if there's unknown risks, it's not something one could recommend adopting to anybody.
Okay, could you define us what safe is to make certain we don't have different assumptions of what the context of safe means?
So technically, to a safety engineer, safe means that you have made a logical argument that you have minimized risks to what they call ALARP, as low as reasonably practical, and that you've assessed those risks and you find them acceptable. And that's the making a claim, essentially a logical claim, that the system is safe to use and operated safely. People create documents, or more often a very large collection of documents data that's called a safety case that asserts the system is safe to use and operated safely.
Okay, got it. So I was just assuming that, I would say not a regular, but an occasional user of this technology, or at least maybe I'm using it much, much more than I realize at the moment. But how do I become aware of the fact that it's either safe or unsafe?
I think everyone is almost universally aware that modern AI in its raw form is not entirely safe. If you ask almost anyone, they will say yes, they're using AI, and no, they don't completely trust it.
Yeah.
And if you're using a tool to make decisions and you don't completely trust that tool, it's inherently unsafe.
Yeah.
So people are placing their own safeguards around that, such as they're not blindly following the advice of the AI. They may be attempting to check the answers. They may not always be able to do that. And they may often, for pressures of time or whatever, just having to accept that they don't entirely trust the answers, but they're using them anyway. So I think that's the position most people find themselves in now, whether it's personal or in a business context.
Okay, and would be just being adding a line, look, hey, what I've produced is AI supported or AI generated. Would that already help the recipient of what you've produced put what you've done into context?
Well, I think the phrases like that are what you might call weasel words. They shift accountability around, don't they? So the producers of AI say things like, don't trust the content, always consult an expert before you make any decisions based on this advice. It's the same as you get the small print on any contract for any kind of product of technology. It doesn't make it any safer or better or help you in any real way.
It's interesting that you say that, okay, it's just like any other product out there, which needs like a risk assessment. aren't we just talking about, you could say, a new technology like any other technology, or do you see a distinctive difference that we're spending so much time on it right now?
So that's a really great question. It goes to the absolute heart of how we need to think about this, because the answer is yes and no. Yes, it is just another technology, and there's a really strong argument that we've never used technologies very safely. For example, look at social media, look at the impacts that's had on politics and economics and on the mindset and behaviors of young people. We never understood the risks. We never attempted to. And as a society, when I say we, and now we're trying to do it retrospectively, and it's a bit late for the generation that was really badly affected by that, and as well as for certain of the political consequences of social media. So, yes, it's like any other technology, but it's also quite different in that it's not even really like normal software, because AI at its heart is a complex algorithm that learns over time to become more complex. And generally, it's so complex, it's hard to understand what it's doing at the beginning. By the time it's learned for a while, it's almost impossible to understand how it's operating. And in particular, the ability to learn means that it has an almost infinite range of inputs and outputs, possible questions you can ask it, possible responses it can give you. This is just a kind of LLM type AI. This applies also to other forms of AI, algorithm or conventionally algorithmic AI. So when you've got a technology which has almost infinite inputs, almost infinite outputs, it's just a bigger challenge. There's a bigger range of things you could use it for, and therefore a bigger range of situations in which it could get out of hand.
Okay. What I'm thinking of, I don't know if this is an analogy which works, but the basic starting point is a black box. But by the sheer nature of AI, by using AI, the box gets blacker.
That is an interesting way to think about it. Yes, over time it gets blacker and blacker. You have less and less understanding of what it's doing. That's
because
a nice way to think about it.
You don't know what's in it, and I mean, some people just okay, I accept it as a black box, but not realizing it's becoming blacker if you start to use that technology. Okay, now, in all fairness, openness, I'm seeing discussions around the globe. Oh, we need AI safe. I mean, these are discussions in parliaments, these are discussions with international institutes. So what are you adding to that discussion where you feel, okay, that's not already being discussed? I need to make people aware of this perspective.
So particularly over the last 2 years, there's been an enormous amount of research into risks of AI.
Yeah.
And the kind of things you need to make safe in AI. A lot of that discussion is very academic and technical. And what has been happening is that standards bodies like ISO, regulatory bodies like NIST, governments like the EU have been bringing out regulations and laws, in the case of the EU, that say you must protect against this risk, that risk, the other risk. And they go a little bit further than that, and they say in order to protect against these risks, you must have certain policies and processes in place when you create and deploy AI-enabled systems. And if you look into the details of these documents, there are a lot of policies and processes that you need to put in place. It's quite overwhelming for a lot of organizations, but nevertheless, it is possible to create those policies. The question is, what are you going to actually do? A process doesn't do work. People do. This is the famous John Seeley Brown quote. So what are you actually going to focus on? And how are you going to operationalize that? And how are you going to make that a seamless, affordable, practical part of your operations as an organization?
Okay, so maybe I'm jumping to some conclusions, your assumptions, but am I hearing you say that, look, you can regulate all you want, put it on paper to keep it safe, but that doesn't actually do anything in real life. And that also seems like that's my assumption. Am I hearing you say we have too many people maybe with a a legal or financial background in a government making these policy decisions and regulations, and maybe too little people who really know how it works, like an engineer. Is that also what you could be advocating for?
So I would say that I'm not criticizing any of these
Okay.
standards or policies. I think they're by and large extremely well
Yeah.
thought out, and has probably been advised by a lot of
Yeah.
AI experts. So I don't want to give the impression I'm pushing back on that. And we do need these kind of standards and regulations. What I'm saying is that there's a danger that if organizations are struggling to implement them, which they will do because it's a lot of complex ideas, they'll end up doing expensive box ticking exercises that don't actually make AI any safer. They just introduce cost and without actually diminishing the risk necessarily. And I'm proposing that there are a range of techniques one can employ to implement these processes so that they actually deliver value, and that range goes from using some mature methodologies, which would be appropriate in high-risk critical industries, to much simpler techniques that almost any organization could adopt without any real difficulty, that borrow from the world of engineering in an understandable way.
Yeah, so it's it's not disregarding we don't need rules and regulations, but addition to rules and regulation makes use of um, industry standards or approaches which are not getting that much attention yet in where policy is being developed.
Yes, I think there's some things that safety engineers do, and systems engineers generally do and are well aware of, that you wouldn't necessarily understand from reading the policies and regulations. You wouldn't necessarily say, okay, I've read this, the EU AI Act, I've read the NIST framework, and now I know that I must use this technique and this technique, because if nothing else, that will cover my back and give me a confidence. It doesn't, there's no obvious jump. And I'm suggesting that there are some simple techniques, and it's quite easy to explain what they are, and people could easily adopt them. And as you say, I've got this interest personally in building tools for communities, and tools can help with adopting them.
Okay. Now, Kees, so far you have made a couple of observations where we can improve safety and reduce risk. Are there any real life examples where you personally have been involved in which showcases that your thinking works?
So one piece of work that I've been involved in, which actually I wanted to do this for 20 years, and I first started thinking about it in the noughties when I was working on an air traffic control system, a very sophisticated one, and for the time, and we were struggling. The project was struggling to remove some faults, although it had been designed in a very clever mathematical way. There were still faults, and they couldn't understand where they were coming from and how to remove them. And that first led me to start thinking about safety and the complexity of it. And at that time, the safety case was a room full of documents. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a tool that could take this room full of documents and could show you the bare bones of it, could explain it to you in a simple way. I did it with a diagram. And that idea wasn't possible to implement with the technology of the noughties, but it is possible now. So we did some work last year, is actually for the defense industry, but it's generically applicable. And what it does is it takes all the documentation you've got about a system, and it extracts from that the claims you're making about the functionality, about the capability, about the safety of that system. And it shows you those claims and the arguments that underpin them in a standard diagram, a very simple diagram, which is actually a notation called goal structuring notation. And it shows you for each claim how it's broken down into subclaims, the logic for breaking it down in that way, shows you the assumptions that are being made. It shows you the evidence that's being used to justify the claims. It shows you other contextual information. And really importantly, it points out where some of those nodes in the diagram might be a bit weak For example, the evidence might be old, or it may be that you're making an assumption about something that actually you could demonstrate and therefore should demonstrate rather than taking an assumption, or vice versa. You might be claiming something that actually is beyond your control. So therefore, you should be making it as an assumption. There's lots of things like that it pulls out. So from a room full of documentation, this AI-powered tool takes it all, processes it, and gives you a really simple diagrammatic depiction of what's really going on here, and therefore what you need to review. Because typically when people review this material, they only have a few hours. They might put time into preparing the meeting itself might only be a couple of hours.
Just to check, am I just hearing you saying I'm using AI to regulate and monitor AI?
Yeah, look, I accept thank you for pointing that out. We've so the work that I've been involved in AI was based on a realization that myself and my business partner now, Peter Lawrence, came to independently and then started working together, which was there's a way to make modern AI, the LLMs, large language models, trustworthy, transparent, and verifiable. And so we've been building that out since then. And I won't go. I can go into if you like, but in a nutshell, we use AI that we have had the University of York validate as being correct, complete, consistent, current, concise, and checkable. All the data quality dimensions. We use our trustworthy AI to pull out things like this safety information, and we do other engineering things as well that I can talk about if you like. But what we're doing is we're taking some really fundamental techniques that systems engineers use, like the process of analyzing safety cases, like the process of managing risks via bow tie diagrams, like the process of iteratively auditing an engineering design as you go through the V model. These things which are really core to modern systems engineering, and we're enabling them with trustworthy AI. And one thing I'm hoping is that people will start to use these engineering techniques for the AI that they're building, to give them confidence that the AI, the systems they're enabling with AI are going to be safe when they're deployed.
And is that also where you feel your main audience is, the people who build the systems or the people who use the systems?
That's another great question, Fritz. There's a really big difference in mindset between people who build particularly software technology and people who use them. So people who've built software technology have traditionally, although they often call themselves software engineers, they don't really have an engineering mindset traditionally. They typically have quite a gung-ho attitude of, well, we've shown that it works. Let's get on it. Let's get it out there. Let's get people using it, and then let's improve it, and let's turn the handle again and again and again, faster and faster and faster. That's the software mindset. That's why we've had this incredible explosion of technology in the last few decades. Engineers are like the opposite. They'll say, hold on a second, this is going to become part of a wider system, potentially a global system. What are the risks, and how have we mitigated them? And have we got just one level of control? I mean, I like, for example, some of the systems that people are most focused on in engineering have a ripple effect that could cascade across society. So engineers don't just put one barrier to consequences of the hazard. They put many barriers in. So if one fails, there'll be others that are still there. But software people don't do that, which is why you get things like the Log4j incident that brought down the internet, because the little logging library.
And I'm sort of thinking when you're sharing the story, I'm also thinking of, I would say, not to be named airplane manufacturers, where the business executive override the engineers about their safety concerns, and then planes really fall out of the sky. It has
exactly, and I mean, we could both probably each list many examples of this happening, and I think possibly people in business who are not technical or in, let's say, in positions of responsibility might be more sympathetic to the engineering mindset of wanting to manage risks, but at the moment they don't quite know what to do about it. They don't have the tools, and systems engineers do have the tools, and it doesn't have to stay in that world, because those tools are actually fairly simple to understand, and they're within everyone's gift to deploy. yes, you might want to take safety advice from a safety consultant, but if it's better than nothing. If you've not got safety engineers on hand, you can still make a safety case. You can still make a bow tie diagram.
Yeah. And so what I'm making, obviously, for the sake of argument, these are generalizations about, okay, the typical mind of a software engineer versus, I would say, the more classic engineer. But what I'm also hearing is, I think that's a positive message, is, ladies and gentlemen, we see a large concern in a growing gap between technology and the legal framework, and that's creating an accountability gap. But just saying, hold on, we have these, let's say, ancient old engineering principles, criteria, which we've used to keep airplane ships safe. We can also apply that same concept, that same thinking to this new technology. In that respect, it's just another technology we need to manage.
Yes, I think that's really true. And what's more, it is possible to do those things more easily than it used to be because of AI, because there are now trustworthy AI tools emerging to help with those techniques. So, yes, the challenge is bigger because AI is more complex than traditional systems, but the tools have been superpowered by the kind of things we're trying to put into place. So there's an opportunity that is kind of rising to meet the challenge.
But what I'm also hearing you say, and I find that interesting, there is this argument amongst the people working in, I would say, in the IT industry, where we need more people in the government, for instance, in regulating organizations. They need a better understanding of what digitization means. But your argument is, well, that might be the case, but you also need a more classic educated engineer who then monitors, I'd say, both almost.
That's a really good way of thinking about it. You need someone, and if you can get a good systems engineer, great. If not, you can try and adopt an engineering mindset, which is about looking holistically at the systems of which your AI is a part. So typically AI is being used to enable some kind of system that is already in place in some form. So there's that system in itself, but that system is itself part of a wider system, which is then part of bigger systems, and so on and so forth. There's all turtles on the back of turtles. And if you think about it in that way, rather than thinking about it in terms of the details of the operation of the ML algorithm, you start to see a better shape for the risks, and you start to see the kind of barriers you can put in place for the consequences of what happens.
And what I also like about this story, you could say it wasn't unintentional. We're also coming back to your own, I would say, ecosystem thinking and background. You do need an ecosystem of people, stakeholders, to make it work. And that's at least what I'm going to get out of this discussion. You need to look at the bigger picture to get the results you're looking for.
Absolutely, and that's really germane to one particular of the techniques I tend to recommend. So I recommend looking at safety cases and using goal structure notation. I recommend using bow tie diagrams to manage threats and consequences of hazards. The third key approach I would recommend is a certain kind of iterative audit of your system as you develop it. So you start very early on with the system, from the first moments in which you're conceiving it, and then do audits which bring together the kind of stakeholder network you're talking about, people with different interests, different contexts, different mindsets, different mental models, to review the implications of deploying the system. And if you do that from the very beginning, what you find is that you get really important insights which then drive the design. So the next turn of the crank is informed by the wider holistic system view, rather than it being developed to quite a refined point by technologists and then delivered it. And then people saying, well, now what we're going to do, we can't even, as you point out, it's a black box. You can't even see inside it. So how are you going to start managing that? You need to be there from the beginning in the room with those people, as you outlined.
Hey, Keith, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I'm also conscious of the time we have at the moment. So I do want to end with a couple of, say, personal questions at the end to put this into context how you are looking at this. First of all, what inspired you to get on this road of thinking you are right now? What triggered you?
So I published my last book in 2021, and super communities, which is what we were talking about last time we did this, for instance. And after that, I started thinking about what I didn't write in that book. And in fact, I'm now thinking about a second edition in which I will add chapters. And one of those chapters is going to be on how organizations can use super communities principles. One is going to be on how nations can use super communities principles to support communities. And the third one is about technology. I deliberately made super communities a very non-technological book. It doesn't discuss software really, but software tools can be an enormous enabler of community initiatives. And when I started thinking about that, of course, it was around the same time that the ChatGPT and the rest of those LLM tools started emerging. So I started thinking about how they could be used. And that's what led me, as I said, to working with Peter on Iterative. And now I want to try and build apps for what I call the Internet of Communities. Well, we used to talk about this, didn't we? And I think we came up with that notion pretty much together. And the idea that you could provide individual technological tools for things like safety. I'm also looking at things like climate adaptation, like helping people transition into greener jobs. There's a whole range of tools at helping people manage their healthcare and work with clinicians and stakeholders in that world to manage their healthcare. These are the sort of apps I think could make up the Internet of Communities, and but it has to use trustworthy AI that people can understand and they can verify for themselves.
So it's the ambition to help support the community as a whole, but make certain we do that in a safe way. That's I get that. Now, final question. Normally we would focus on, okay, what would your advice to young managers? But I want to expand that to what's your advice to people using AI? What's for you the biggest, I'd say, learning you can give them?
If you try and take this wider holistic perspective that engineers are trained to do, you'll not only end up building tools that are safer, you'll end up building better tools, because thinking about safety is a really good way to think about what something actually does and how it can do it as effectively as possible. You'll end up spending less money building better tools that deliver more value to your stakeholder network through looking at it from a lens of safety.
That is a great advice to end this great discussion on, Keith. Hey, thank you for giving us an update what you've been working on the last couple of years, and I wish you success. And again, thanks for being on The Brand Called You.
Thanks, Fritz.
Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.